مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في حملتنا الرئاسية الأخيرة فازت المرشحة الأنثى بالتصويت الشعبي بفارق يزيد عن مليوني صوت على الرجل آمن الكثيرون عنه مدان بالتحرش الجنسي. ولكن بسبب نظام أميركا الانتخابي الفريد خسرت المجموعة الانتخابي وخسرت الانتخابات. هذه المرة هل سيرشح الديمقراطيون سيدة أخرى؟ هل ستكون المرشحة أفضل أداء في 2020 من هيلاري كلينتون في 2016؟ هل ستدعم النساء الجمهوريات الرئيس من جديد؟ لمناقشة أحوال المرأة والسياسة في انتخابات الرئاسية يسرني أن أرحب بخبيرة السياسات سارة فارس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. They make up more than half the population and certainly more than half of the voting public. They're underrepresented in both the House and the Senate, and one has never served as president. I'm talking, of course, about women in American politics. Will 2020 be different? 2024? We're going to discuss these issues with Sarah Faris. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So 2018 was a big year for women in American politics. What happened and why?
Well, in 2018, we had the midterm elections, the first nationwide election since President Trump was elected. And what we saw was a Democratic wave. There was a surge in momentum for Democratic candidates as well as Democratic women. There's a record number of women now serving in Congress, 102 women. And what we saw was that that surge in interest among women voters helps deliver the House of Representatives to Democrats. So Democrats were able to take back the House for the first time in 8 years, and that's in large part because of the number of women who turned out to vote.
So women voters also voting for women candidates.
That's right. So the Democratic candidates in 2018 had the largest voter margin securing the votes of women in any midterm election in history. So they were able to draw more than 50% of the closer to 60% of the women in the country voting for Democrats.
Do we have any inkling whether male voters have any hesitation for voting for female candidates these days?
Well, what's really interesting is political science over the years has proven time and time again that that gender is not so much a factor in who people vote for. It's all about the party affiliation. So in history, men in America have tended to vote Republican. Women have tended to vote Democratic. That's in large part driven by other demographic factors such as education status, such as race. But overall, we have seen more women than men voting Democratic.
Interesting. Already, how is 2020 shaping up?
Well, we have a half a dozen candidates from the Senate who are 4 candidates from the Senate who are women, and these are front runners. Senator Kamala Harris of California has pretty strong name recognition. She's had very strong fundraising hauls. We also have Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, and these are really powerful women who've served in the Senate for several years. Now they're trying to raise their national profile. They're hoping to catch fire in a way that ultimately gives them the White House. And this is really the first time we've seen so many high-powered female candidates running for the White House at one time.
When you look at this group of women senators running, is there any commonality in their themes, in their what they're emphasizing, or are they just like any other candidates emphasizing various themes?
It really is that they're emphasizing their own themes. They have all of them have their own lane that they see in this presidential election. Kamala Harris, for example, she's a former prosecutor from California. She's very hard charging. She will talk directly about President Trump. She does not shy away from speaking about him. Amy Klobuchar, on the other hand, she is a much more moderate Democrat. She comes from Minnesota. It's a Midwestern state that nearly voted for, that has in past times voted for Republicans. I believe it did vote for President Trump in 2016. And so she faces a much different demographic. She's speaking to a different subset of people. She wants to help deliver the Midwest, which President Trump had won in 2016. She thinks that's how she'll be able to defeat him. So there really are not the kind of themes that you might expect from a lot of women candidates. In past times, we've seen female candidates talking more about paid family leave, for example, or talking more about childcare, talking more about family issues, and that's really not the case. And Democratic candidates are trying to make it, they're trying to cover all their bases. They want to talk about national security. At the same time, they're talking about how to help deliver higher wages to the average family. So they're not taking on a female-centric campaign in any way that I've seen.
And then when one looks at the emergence of this large progressive caucus in the Democratic Party, the three most outspoken new arrivals to the House of Representatives are themselves all women.
That's right. So we have Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. She has millions of Twitter followers. She has changed the social media scene on Capitol Hill in a way that Democratic leaders are trying to catch up with now. For example, this Congresswoman from New York, she beat out an incumbent who was expected to win. He was expected to potentially become the next Speaker of the House one day, and she beat him last year and has come to Congress and given lessons about how to use Twitter to her fellow Democrats. She's really changing the way that the House operates. It's becoming less of a top-down institution because of women like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because of women like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. Both of these women they were the first two Muslim women to serve in Congress, and they have had a very large following on social media. They've come in unafraid to criticize past positions of the Democratic Party. For example, U.S. support for Israel is one issue that's really come up in the House several times over the last several weeks. And so we've seen, not because they're female representatives and not because they come in wanting to bring in a women's perspective, but they have harnessed the attention of the country in a way that I think is partly because they have historic roles in Congress. They're part of a historic female-driven class, particularly the first Muslim women representatives. That's a title that has these two women have really relished. They're really excited about their role in this, but it's not because they're women.
All right, let's take a step back. I want to ask you, when you look at what's gone on the last couple of years and when you look ahead, long-term impact of Hillary Clinton, what do you think?
Well, I think the 2016 election being so stunning as it was, and we saw Donald Trump winning the white women vote of white women who do not have a college education. I think that was a wake-up call to candidates like Hillary Clinton who hadn't thought to prioritize that. You have the first female presidential candidate of a major party on the ticket, and she did not think to go and campaign to these women in the Midwestern states that ultimately voted for Trump. She hadn't put an emphasis on this demographic that might have otherwise assumed to have voted for her. We especially back in 2016, there were allegations of sexual misconduct. There were allegations against Mr. Trump in a way that the women's vote was not something that the Democratic Party was worried about losing, and yet there was 53% of white women who voted for Donald Trump, a majority of white women. And so this is something that the Democratic Party is not going to take for granted anymore. And
but is the takeaway from this, we need to fight for that vote, or is the takeaway for this, oh my gosh, let's not nominate another woman presidential candidate so soon?
I think, well, American politics in general are so personality-based, and Hillary Clinton, of course, had decades of time in the public spotlight. There's several generations of people had been exposed to her for years in a way that they didn't feel comfortable voting for her. There were just too many. There were too many things in her past. Of course, being the wife of a former president, her public profile had been set in a way that just the country was not interested in, and that was proven. And there are a lot of political experts who've said that she just was not a great presidential candidate. So I think putting it as she was our first female candidate on a major ticket, major party's ticket, I don't think that's a fair characterization of what lays ahead. And there's some skepticism, I'm sure, in some groups about what it means to take that risk and to do this again in 2020. But I think the main takeaway is that you can't take a group for granted that has historically voted Democratic or would lean Democratic in a normal election. I think 2016 wasn't a normal election with a presidential candidate who just was that unpopular.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to also expand the conversation to talk about the Republican Party and women in just a moment. My guest today is Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers the House of Representatives for Politico, one of Washington's must-read news sources. Previously, she covered the federal budget and appropriations for Politico Pro, and she reported for The Hill, The Washington Post, and the Houston Chronicle. All right, before we move to the Republicans, I just want to ask you about the most important Democrat, the most important female politician in America today, and that's Nancy Pelosi. People thought that her political career was over for a while. Amazing comeback. What's her situation today?
She is at the top of the Democratic caucus. She has affirmed her power there. She's brought in a lot of these new progressives who have come in with these massive social media followings. They come in with these very big ideas, and she's really gotten them under her control. They're not in, these new members aren't in the House demanding votes on the Green New Deal or other very large initiatives that they came in with. They're willing to fall in line behind her, which is a really remarkable transition, and it just shows how influential she is, because just months ago it was uncertain if she would be able to remain Speaker, and of course she is. She's now moving ahead with some very aggressive tactics to challenge President Trump. They're trying to get his tax returns. They're trying to get the investigation, the full investigation that Special Counsel Robert Mueller has fulfilled over the last several months. She's really strategized exactly how she wants to challenge President Trump in a way that she can also lay out this domestic agenda, voting on gun control, voting on voter fraud and election initiatives, and she's really been able to have this two-track approach that a lot of her House Democratic colleagues are really praising her for. And
last time Donald Trump ran against her in some way and kept referring to her, the Pelosi progressive left-wing part of the party, are people preparing for her to be one of the faces of the party in 2020?
So what's really interesting is Speaker Nancy Pelosi is not the face of Republican messaging ads right now, and I don't think we're going to see her in every attack ad on television for the next election cycle. And what's actually been happening is that the Republican operatives have been shifting to focus on socialism. They want to talk about Democrats who are pushing Medicare for all, very big national health care programs that they say would wipe out private insurance. They want to focus on what they view as extreme ways to combat climate change. So the focus has become less on Nancy Pelosi, who of course was able to deliver the House majority back to Democrats in the last election, and they're focusing more on some of these younger, more progressive candidates who have explosive ideas that they think will be detrimental to Democratic Party overall in 2020. So I think the focus is going to be on the idea of socialism. Some of these newcomer candidates, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is featured in almost every Republican attack ad that I've seen so far this year, and I think that's really going to be where the focus is.
So let me ask you about women in the Republican Party. As you noted earlier, Republicans won a majority of white women in Donald Trump's election. Since then, we've had the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination, we've had Me Too, huge national issues. Where are Republicans and women today?
So the Republicans will readily admit that they have a women problem, and there are 13 House Republican women in the House right now. there's 13. This is less than half of what it was just the last cycle. And what happened was the Republican Party saw a lot of its candidates be beaten out by some of these new Democrats who are serving in office for the first time. And they are making an effort to make sure they're promoting their Republican women internally. There is Congresswoman Liz Cheney is now in leadership. She's, of course, the daughter of the former vice president, and she has this high profile already. They're really hoping that she can help deliver back part of that women's vote. And her message, I spoke to her the other day about how she helps. How do you help with this women problem? She said, we don't want to talk about it as in this is a women's problem. We don't want to be talking about women's issues as if they're not the same as everyone else's issues. She says, we're going to keep talking about national security. We're not going to focus on just family issues because women are competent voters. They can focus on every issue. So that's really their strategy, is to not try and focus on paid family leave or addressing the gender pay gap, which Democrats have been readily trying to address on the floor. But instead, they're going to try and have a broad repertoire of issues available that they hope can attract the same Republican women voters who have voted for Republicans in the past, but some of them did vote for Democrats in the last election.
So is there fear that that 53% is weakening? Are they worried that the Democrats will chip into this?
Absolutely, and we did see that number weaken in 2018. We did see more white women voting for Democrats. Crucially, white women with college degrees overwhelmingly are voting for Democrats, which was something that had not quite been there in 2016. And now Democrats are hoping to boost this number even higher. So the Republicans are not only facing just a dearth of women in their own party serving in Congress. There was only one new Republican woman to be sworn in January in the House. And so they're not only facing that issue, but they also have this voter issue across the country. So they're trying to recruit new candidates, bring more women into the House, but they also have to address this broader voter problem.
When you look out across the country, state houses, big city mayors, these sorts of things, are we seeing more women running and winning these seats?
Well, a lot of the big city mayors are Democrats, and a lot of them are women, but it's just that there's not a large bench. There's not a lot of women candidates who are in line to run for Republican offices. In a lot of these more rural areas, it has tended to be men at the top, and that goes for politicians, that goes for judges who might eventually run. So there's just not a lot of women who've indicated interest in House races, in Senate races. There are no Republican women in contest for the presidential race. We saw very few in the last several years. So it's a broader leadership issue for them.
And for Democrats, when you look across the country, is there a farm system, if we would use a baseball analogy? Are there Democratic legislators and governors and mayors that are women?
Absolutely. I mean, one example is Stacey Abrams of Georgia. She, of course, did not win the governor race. It was extremely closer than a lot of people had expected. She really garnered national attention for her successes in that race. She's now openly considering a Senate bid. She also has not entirely ruled out a presidential race. So that's just one example of how there are a lot of races in the states where Democratic women are ready to run, and they have built themselves up some sort of a political profile versus a lot of the Republican women. Many of them are coming from the private business, the private sector, which is a little bit more difficult. They have struggled with fundraising in the past. That's something that I've talked to a lot of Republican women candidates or elected officials. They've talked a lot about how it's harder to raise money as a female Republican. And that's something that Democrats have been doing a better job in their party addressing.
So let me ask you a big picture question. This is a fascinating conversation about the details of the role of women in American political life today. When you put this in a global context, American women are just so far behind women in almost every other major Western and non-Western democracy in terms of taking their rightful share of seats in parliament, leadership roles at the national level, prime ministers, presidents, that sort of thing. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think it goes back to the institutional system that's been in place. I mean, when Congress has been led by men for decades, it's harder for women to break into that. And Congress itself is a very top-down system. It's based on seniority. It's based on fundraising. It's based on your connections to other leaders. I mean, for decades, for example, the most important committee in the House is the Appropriations Committee, the Spending Committee. And they have a tendency, they go in a back room, they smoke their cigars. It's a boys' club. And I've talked to a lot of Democratic and Republican women who've talked about breaking into that boys' club. And one way that women are doing that right now is they've served in the military, and they're able to assert their knowledge of national security issues, for example, and they're breaking their way into committees that have traditionally been male-dominated. For example, Armed Services is now has very high-profile members such as Liz Cheney, who I mentioned before, who has a broad array of experience having served in the State Department. And so we're seeing as women are climbing up the ladder at institutions like the military, the State Department, they're able to find ways to rise in Congress and break into institutions within Congress, such as these committees that have historically been male-dominated. So it's been a very slow-going process. It's something that both parties say that they're committed to doing. Of course, Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been a trailblazer on many accounts, and her coming back to become the Speaker this year again was a really historic moment, and it showed just the prowess that she's exerted and that she's becoming a model for so many other women in the House who are hoping to take that seat one day.
All right, Sarah Ferris, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for joining us in Daphne, Washington.
I think the 2020 election is going to really determine the course of the country for, are we going to continue with the success that we've had under one president, or are we going to put the brakes on and turn into Venezuela or some other country that doesn't look like this one?
In the history of politics and government, America has a lot to be proud of. Our founders created one of the world's first democratic republics. We are governed by a constitution that is the longest uninterrupted period of government under a document in the history of the world. We have the world's oldest continuous political party, the Democratic Party, founded by no less than Thomas Jefferson. And the list goes on. But among the items of which we are justly proud, we can't really include the role of women in politics. Women are not mentioned in either the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Women weren't guaranteed the right to vote in federal elections until the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1920, nearly 150 years after the original was approved. That was 4 years after the first women were elected to the United States Congress, and 2 years before the first woman served in the United States Senate. Also, about 150 years after the Constitution was approved. And today, even with the influx of women into Congress in the 2018 legislative election, only 102 of the 435 congressional representatives are women. That's less than 1/4. And in the Senate, the percentage is almost exactly the same, 23 out of 100. Compare that to this list of countries, all of whom have at least 40% of their parliaments consisting of women legislators. Sweden, South Africa, Senegal, Norway, Nicaragua, Namibia, Mexico, Grenada, Finland, Cuba, Costa Rica, Bolivia. And in first place is Rwanda with 61%. And in terms of elected Democratic leaders, women have served as presidents and prime ministers in dozens of countries, from Britain and France to Brazil and Argentina to Bangladesh and Israel. In America, the number is famously 0. When will a woman win the Oval Office? 2020? 2024? I don't know. But I do know that on the important issue of women's role in politics, we still have a long way to go. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور المرأة في السياسة في بلدكم، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.